This is a conversation with Sir Lawrence Freedman, a legendary British historian of war, strategy, and foreign policy, and a frequent commentator on the issues of war and strategy of today as well. I took this opportunity to sort of pick his brain on the main conflicts of today, starting in the Middle East, and trying to understand whether Israel can consider the 12-day war against Iran a success, whether it made sense for the US to join in, or what would he do if he were now the supreme leader in Tehran? And then we talk about the big picture in Ukraine, about why Russia is stuck fighting the war with no real good way out, whether we will see a negotiated settlement and what it might look like, or whether this war will be decided on the battlefield. How long can the war possibly go on, or why drones are not really the future of war in the way that we think they are. If you want more geopolitical analysis to help you filter all the noise from the stuff that actually matters, consider subscribing to my newsletter, where I break down big picture geopolitical stories, trends, and patterns. You can find a link in the description. And as a reminder, the corporate partner of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be with you.
So, as I was just saying, I'd love to pick your brain on a few issues, and I think it would make sense to start in the Middle East. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on now, in retrospectively, on the 12-day war between Iran and Israel that seems now to have ended, at least for now. Do you think, looking at it now from a strategic perspective, that it was a good decision for Israel to attack Iran? And do you think that from their perspective, it was a success?
I mean, whether it was a good decision is a difficult one. It depends on what else you think might have happened. And it does depend on whether it achieved their objectives. And the jury's sort of out on that. So how to stop? I mean, I think first let's just take the specific question of Iran's nuclear capabilities. I think first Netanyahu knew that it would be very difficult to achieve what he objected unless he got the Americans involved, and it was by no means definite that the Americans would get involved. So in that sense, it worked out. However, the Americans didn't get wholeheartedly involved. There were basically one a day of activity, and that was it. And then next, Trump was calling a ceasefire. I think before the Israelis would have actually preferred themselves. The Israelis would rather it have gone on a bit, and certainly the Americans had done more. And this has left open this question of whether or not Iran's nuclear program has been obliterated, as Trump has described it, or damaged a bit, or somewhere in between. I'm tempted to somewhere in between myself, but I mean, it's difficult to know. And the issue here is partly what happened to the 40 kilograms of already enriched uranium, that had either been concealed or put in some safe place. But there were always suggestions that Israel would be careful about attacking that, not because of explosions, but because of radiation risks and so on. Anyway, it doesn't seem to have been attacked and is somewhere. Then there's a question of whether or not sufficient centrifuges have survived for that to be enriched from the sort of 60% that it is now to the 90% you need for weapons grade. And then there's the question of the damage done to other facilities relevant to weaponization, which we also know were attacked, as well as a number of nuclear scientists who were assassinated. And it's very difficult from the information we've seen, including a variety of leaks from the US intelligence community, as to exactly where this is. And you're hearing, and I've seen quite conflicting reports. My guess is it's not that easy for the Iranians to put it all together again quickly, but not impossible, and that they will, and if nothing else changes, they will gradually seek ways of doing it. And one of the things they have to reckon with is Israel clearly knows an awful lot about what's going on in Iran. And I think that'll lead to some anxieties that if they just carry on where they left off, there could be a repeat performance. But I think we're a long way from knowing all of that, and the situation will clear up. There's a second level. Now, Trump said very clearly, although he seemed to suggest otherwise at one point, but generally they were consistent that this is not about regime change. Netanyahu clearly would have liked regime change, but I suspect he was realistic to know that it's not going to happen as a result of Israeli strikes. It'll happen for Iranian reasons in Iranian ways. And so I think that's, again, something that can be watched, but I don't that'll get us by surprise, and it'll be the result of clashes within the elite or some popular movement again because somebody decides to clamp down on women's dress, or the economic situation gets dire and there's some food riots or whatever. I mean, it's just very difficult to know how that's going to develop. But it hasn't left the regime stronger. It's weaker. And then third, there's this general question of weakness, where I suspect Israel is pretty satisfied. So if you go back to all the events since October 23, you've got a quote unquote axis of resistance that has been dismantled in many ways. Hamas is hanging in there, and that's a frustration to Israel and is providing a rationale for more and more attacks on Palestinians, but it doesn't seem to me to be achieving an awful lot other than adding to the humanitarian disaster. But they've also taken out Hezbollah, which is in all past scenarios would have been very active while Israel and America was striking. Hezbollah couldn't do anything. The Houthis got one drone through. And Syria's gone. And Iran looked helpless. Most of its missiles didn't hit anything. A couple hit significant target, but not in a way that did lasting damage to Israel, kill people. Drones, 99.9% or something, shot down, and its air defences were useless and taken apart, and may remain taken apart. A lot of its missile capability was either used up or destroyed, or a lot of launches were destroyed. So Iran is considerably weaker as a result of all of this. Again, Iran can reconstruct to a degree, but you have to wonder whether some people, at least within the establishment, possibly not amongst the clerics or the military, will be asking, is this really the best use of our resources and time to sort of lead an anti-Zionist campaign, which the main Arab countries have got no interest in anymore, when we've got such big problems at home? And I think it's those sort of debates that will allow us to assess eventually the impact of these events. So, I think Israel at the moment will view it positively, but not necessarily a decisive victory. I think Iran has got some big issues, really big issues to address about whether it just carries on as before. I think Trump will claim it as a victory until somebody shows it that there is still a nuclear program there. Or, if attacks do start to be made, terrorist attacks against American assets or whatever. So he obviously wants to put a line under it all and talk about deals and so on. But I find it difficult to see what sort of deal is possible at the moment. It may become possible, but not nothing very obvious at the moment.
Well, you've mentioned that for the US, their priority, unlike with Israel, was quite clearly to stop or damage Iranian nuclear ambitions. And it's, as you said, difficult to assess that if we don't know what exactly has been the impact of the strikes. But there is the argument that this might convince Iran to actually double down and try to get the nuclear bomb as soon as possible in order to prevent this from happening again. Do you think that makes sense?
But if I was an Iranian, I could imagine arguing that. Yeah, if we'd already had nuclear weapons, doubtful that either the Israelis or the Americans would have done this. The problem they've got is, as was demonstrated, as these two countries will do a lot to stop them getting there. And so, unless you're pretty confident you can do this quietly, surreptitiously, without anybody noticing, uh, then all you're doing is inviting more attacks in the future if it becomes evident that that's where you're going. Now, a lot of this depends on whether the IEA is around still, whether it walks away from the non-proliferation treaty, and so on and so forth. And I think there will be discussions around that. The Europeans will be involved in that. And of course, it still remains the case that there's a big issue for the Iranians in terms of the need to get sanctions off the economy's in a total mess. So I think there will be a strong case being made that this shows more than ever why they were right to have a nuclear program, and that they can't be content with just being a threshold state. They have to go the whole way. I mean, there are others who will say, yes, but how can we do that without giving the game away? Israel seems to know pretty well a lot of what we're doing. So is there a risk that we'll just be found out and we'll get the bombs back again?
You wrote a while ago about the fallacy of short wars in foreign policy and on your Substack, which I really enjoyed, and I really like the argument you were making of how leaders often expect that wars will be quick and decisive, but usually they are not. And I think it's interesting that maybe in this case, even though a lot of people were worried about escalations into a larger regional war, this was actually one of those successful exceptions, wasn't it? When we had a quick, clean, short war.
Yes and no. I mean, it was contained. It wasn't a land war, and so any war in which doesn't involve a clash of armies is likely to be limited, contained. On the other hand, this is something that's been going on since 1979. Now 1980, where there was hostage crisis. So when Khomeini handed over the Israeli embassy in Tehran, which is, people forget, was Israel's second biggest after Washington. Israel had a close relationship with the Shah, and Khomeini handed over the embassy to the Palestinians, then fell out with the Palestinians later, but that's another story. But I mean, it's been going on arguably 45 years, and there have been a number of episodes. So it's not a continuous war. We call it with continuous fighting, but it's part of the same conflict. The conflict's been going on one way or the other. And at the moment, it's hard to see, for reasons we've just been discussing, why this by itself will necessarily bring it to a close, unless there is some sort of regime change, which is not impossible, but I don't think Israel has a means of engineering that.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I describe a chaotic oil war that's been going on between the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, that you basically never hear about, but that's quietly shaping geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation. What do you think are the chances of that, of the regime falling or the regime surviving? Not because of Israel, but because of internal pressure. Because it seems that the regime is under so much pressure and in a pretty bad shape, but it's extremely hard to predict how long these regimes can go on or what and when will make them fall in the end.
And when it happened, we'll all say it was, in retrospect, inevitable. But I mean, I think the regime is in trouble. But it's been in trouble for a long time. It suppresses dissent. It it knows when to push and when not to push. So laws on how women should dress are sort of held back and not fully enforced because they know they're unpopular. They've got a real problem with the economy, with inflation. And I think that's its greatest vulnerability. In the end, the supreme leader is ailing. He looked pretty awful in his appearances during this current bout of fighting, but he's been ailing for a long time, and presumably there is some plan in place about his succession, whether or not it's his son or somebody else. So I don't think I think it's entirely possible, but I wouldn't want to bet on it. I mean, the regime may find ways of reform. I think the problem, I'll say, is the problem for regimes that try to reform, as opposed just to keep on clamping down on the opposition, is you create expectations and momentum that's then hard to fulfill. So it's often regimes that are trying to make some sort of limited concessions that can become quite vulnerable. But as I say, I think that the only safe assumption is the regime continues, but you have to be prepared for something sudden and surprising as well. It would, it's a big country. I don't think it would sort of break up into warlords or anything. I don't think it would. I think it's long been pretty centralized. So I think you are looking at Tehran and the possibility of a different sort of government. But as I say, I think it's the only safe assumption is that you'll be dealing with the same cast of characters over the next few years.
What do you think is going to be the wider impact for the Iranian, Russian, Chinese axis of upheaval, as it's sometimes called, the partnership or alliance they have?
Well, I think Iran was very aware that nobody came to its aid. It was very much on its own. The foreign minister went to Moscow sort of at the end of it all, but didn't get very much. So I don't think it demonstrates that Russia is in any position or willing to help its partners when they get into trouble, just like it wasn't able to help Assad. I mean, it's just totally caught up in Ukraine. It doesn't have any spare capacity. And I don't think anybody would have expected China to do much other than deplore what the Israelis and the Americans were up to. So I think the Iranians will be feeling quite alone in all of this, aware that they don't have natural allies, and their most natural ally was Hezbollah, which has been sort of pummeled into restraint, partly because the Lebanese government is able to say, you really mustn't get us into any more wars. The country can't take it. Well, has to keep. I mean, Israel has behaved pretty ruthlessly and relentlessly, but it didn't start the war with Hezbollah. Hezbollah could have stayed out, or it could have entered the war where Hamas did in a much more substantial way. It decided to make a sort of gesture on behalf of Hamas, which I think badly backfired in the end, because it gave Israel the excuse, when it was ready to do so, to really attack it pretty ruthlessly.
I think on the note of Russia and China, I guess one thing maybe I would expect is that other regimes potentially might see that when the push comes to shove, Russia is probably not going to come to their aid as it didn't do it with either Assad or Iran. So do you think it might damage their future?
Yeah, I mean, it confirms the limitations of Russian power and Chinese power for that matter. I mean, China doesn't really see itself as an active military power outside its own region. Um, and so I don't think there's ever much chance. But Russia, saved Assad when it intervened in 2015, um, when Iran and Hezbollah were struggling to keep Assad going. And had made itself a serious Middle Eastern power. I mean, it had to be taken seriously. I mean, it's no longer an effective Middle Eastern power, and I think it also, I mean, it has a funny relationship with Israel because Netanyahu and Putin not always got on that badly. So I don't think it ever really wanted to get into a fight with Israel, especially as Israel, in some ways, at least in their power, would be stronger. So I think it's a pretty clear confirmation of the limits of Russian power, and others will notice. I mean, Russia's just not involved in any initiatives on almost anything at the moment other than those connected with Ukraine.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now back to the conversation. So let's move to Europe and start with war in Ukraine, because I'd love to know what is your big picture view of where the war in Ukraine is now. Do you think that it's a stalemate? And if it is a stalemate, then how long you think it can stay like this?
And I wouldn't use words like stalemate or deadlock because there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of things going on. But neither side has a compelling theory of victory, as it were. I think Russia has been having one offensive after the other. And really, the latest one you can argue started in late 23. And it's not achieved a lot. I mean, it has achieved things, they've advanced a bit, but at enormous cost. If you don't believe all the numbers coming out of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, which have put it all a couple of 100,000 lost this year. If you don't, I mean, even if it's 100,000, it's a heck of a lot for limited games. So Russia, I think, is faced with the problem that it hasn't got an obvious means yet. I think this is a disappointment to Putin of breaking through. I mean, at some point it can happen. People always, use the phrase "suddenly, then gradually, then suddenly," but it hasn't happened yet, and they've been trying for a very long time. And lots of the towns they're still trying to get, like Pokrovsk, they've been trying to get for a year now. So I think that's frustrating. What they are doing, where their capacity is growing, is mounting attacks on Ukrainian cities, which have, I mean, they're not devastating in the sense of sort of Second World War air raid, and they're nasty and really tiring for the Ukrainians. Talk to Ukrainians, I think that's what they say, is by and large they can find shelter and so on. And buildings get destroyed, but it's just wearing night after night. And whereas last year they may have been sending 400 drones a month, and now they can do it a night. So most don't get through, many are jammed and so on, or decoys, but it's not good. So I think Ukraine is sort of, well, that's why I think Ukraine would quite welcome a ceasefire, because I think it's going to capitulate because of this. They could do with a break. Russia doesn't have those. I mean, Russia's got issues with manpower, how long it can keep on going, its economy. is overheated, inflation's growing, interest rates are high, and I think Putin wants to get them down, but the inflationary risks of that are quite high. And Ukraine is doing more and more on Russian soil. And it's not killing people in the numbers that Russia is killing people, but actually some of its strikes are quite significant. And that must be a bother. So my feeling is there's an element of one last push about what Russia is doing at the moment. On the other hand, I just find it difficult to see how Putin gets out of this. I think he's boxed himself in. He's done that by his demands on the annexations of Ukrainian oblasts being recognized by Ukraine and the international community, by demands for demilitarization and so on, which aren't going to happen. I mean, they can't enforce these. And I think he's affected by the fear of losing, which I always try to stress is not the same. Not losing is not the same as winning. And I think not losing is quite important to him because there's a reckoning if you lose. If the war ends and they haven't achieved any of their political objectives, which is currently the case, then how do you explain it? What have you been doing all this time? What does it mean for the future? So I think Putin. I don't think Putin knows a way out of this at the moment, other than to carry on with the fighting. And I don't think Ukraine has got much choice but to carry on fighting because it knows what happens when Russia occupies. So it's which is a pretty gloomy conclusion. It's not easy to see an early end of this, but there's a lot we don't know. We don't wholly know what's going on in the Kremlin. You can have a sudden collapse of some units on the front, a surprise attack that gets either Ukrainian or Russian forces caught out and allows for some sort of breakthrough. But I mean, both sides have a problem. Maybe Russia even more than Ukraine but both sides have the problem of even if they sort of punch a little hole in the front lines, they don't really have the capacity to exploit it. Because they just don't have the mobility. And that's why, I thought the best thing going for the Trump process was maybe it would make sense for Putin to have a ceasefire and then have lots of negotiations afterwards, which would go on forever because they'd never settle anything. But at least you would be sort of futile in negotiations rather than futile in military operations. But and because Trump is the best option he's got, I mean, he's not going to get a more sympathetic American president. I wouldn't think he might. He wouldn't want to rely on it. And if that's the case, you might want to take your chances when you can. So I thought he might make more of an effort, although it didn't take very much to compare what Trump was offering and what Putin wanted, to see the enormous gap between the two.
So why do you think he didn't take it? Because I agree with your assessment largely, and that in a way he is in a bit of a stuck situation. So you would think that Donald Trump coming in would be a blessing in disguise, and he would jump after that opportunity, and he seemed unwilling to give Donald Trump anything at all in the negotiation.
Yeah, I just think he doesn't know how to offer concessions. He's got no concessions he wants to offer, because and I think this is possibly an underappreciated aspect of the situation. I mean, Trump's view was that he was offering Putin a lot. Hold the territory you've got. Keep Ukraine out of NATO. Normalize relations with the US, and we'll have great economic deals and so on. I think the difficulty for Putin is if there is a ceasefire on the basis of of the territorial status quo. Then he's stuck with a chunk of territory which is full of unexploded ordnance. There's little economic activity. Is depopulated. The population that's left, a lot of it, and all of it is hostile. A large border that will need defend. It's not a great deal unless you've got a different regime in Kiev, which is why he started off the way he did. It's not. He's just making his situation more difficult, and he got frustrated with the Minsk deals because they left him in charge of or having to subsidize the enclaves in Donetsk and Luhansk, with Ukraine paying, not paying over anything. And we're sort of stuck with them and having to defend them. And the Ukrainians were just sort of sitting on their hands saying, fine, you took them, you can look after them. And I don't think he wants to have that situation. So you'd have to start to get pretty imaginative in thinking of arrangements. If you look back in the early conversations and some of the ideas Zelensky was pushing, when it was very different. I mean, the early stages of the war when you hadn't had the revelations about Bushehr and all sorts of things. There were some quite interesting ideas around, and you can see ideas for lease back and so on, the sort we had with Hong Kong and we discussed with the Falls. I mean, there's all sorts of formulas that you can use, but I don't think they get to the heart of the problem. And the only possible negotiated outcome at the moment, as far as I can see, is a ceasefire followed by prolonged and probably pretty fruitless negotiations over a long-term settlement. And you can imagine bits and pieces to make the ceasefire more acceptable, some sanctions relief, and so on. But I find it very difficult to imagine anything other than that, so long as Putin is there and his reputation is at stake.
Isn't the issue with ceasefire from the Ukrainian perspective that Russia can just use the time to regenerate and then break it the first moment they see a good opportunity and try the same thing again? Thank you for listening to the free part of this interview. The conversation is not over yet, but the next part is only for the paid members on my Patreon or Substack. I try to make the best possible geopolitics content, and I put a lot of effort and time into this podcast. And there's quite a lot of costs that I have to pay that are associated with it. It's the supporters on Patreon that allow me to do all that, and making part of every single interview exclusively available only for them is my way of saying thank you, since without them, it just wouldn't exist. So if you want to listen to the rest of the interview, ask questions to guests who appear on the show, or myself, get bonus content and my own takes on geopolitics, become part of an active community of geopolitics enthusiasts, and most importantly, make the continued existence of this podcast possible, do consider becoming a supporter. It really helps. To join, you can find the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics.